Hello. Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning to you all.
How are you?
Very well. How are you all? Good to see you.
Fine. Thank you. Welcome. Welcome.
Thank you.
I heartily welcome Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Member of Parliament, former UN diplomat, former Union Minister, who has kindly consented to deliver a talk on the India's foreign policy under late Shri P.V. Narasimha Rao as Prime Minister. I thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you, sir. I also heartily welcome Dr. Ramchandra Kuntia, AICC in charge Telangana State, who is joining on the Zoom app from Bhubaneswar. I also welcome Shri N.S. Bose Raju Garu, AIC Secretary in charge Telangana. He is joining us from Bangalore. And there are about 120 participants on Zoom app now, and quite a large number of people already on the Facebook. Now here in this hall in the Congress Party office in Hyderabad, it's a great honor and a privilege for me to be here. Along with me is Dr. J. Geeta Reddy, who's been working very hard to make this program a success, a former minister and a very senior leader of the Congress Party in Telangana. As Dr. Shashi Tharoor would know, she's doing a wonderful job as AAPC Zonal Coordinator for South Zone. Along with me is Shri V. Hanumantrao Garu, who is a former 3-term Rajya Sabha MP and a former PCC President. He is also Honorary Chairman of the P.V. Narasimha Rao Birth Centenary Celebrations Committee. Watching this program from his residence is Shri P.V. Manohar Rao Garu, brother of Shri P.V. Narasimha Rao Garu. Then is Mr. Sridhar Babu, 4-term MLA, present MLA, former minister, and also he is the Vice Chairman of the Birth Centenary Celebrations Committee. I should also mention here, it would be of interest to Dr. Shashi Tharoor and Kuntia ji and Bosraj Garu, that it was Sridhar Babu, who was Legislative Affairs Minister, moved a resolution in the Andhra Pradesh Assembly to give a Bharat Ratna to late P.V. Narasimha Rao Garu. Mahesh Gaud, who is the convener of this committee, has just recovered from coronavirus. He's just been discharged from the hospital and he's on this program on Zoom app from his house. Then senior leader and vice president of the PCC and member of this committee, Dr. Mallu Ravi, and Dr. Dasoju Shravan, who is the chief spokesperson of Telangana PCC and national spokesperson, and who is working also very hard for this event. He's also here with us. Dr. Shravan Kumar, who is the Telangana chairman, state chairman of the Professional Congress Telangana chapter, is also here with us. Shri Harkara Venugopal Rao, who is the General Secretary PCC and who has been interacting with P.V. Narasimha Rao's family in Hyderabad to involve them in all activities. Then is Mettusai Secretary and Hari Prasad PRO Gandhi Bhavan. I welcome everybody and now hand over to Dr. J. Geeta Reddy Garu to conduct the function. Thank you.
Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Well, after the introductions by our President, Shri Uttam Kumar Reddy ji, I would like to go a little further. A lot of you have already logged in, so my thanks for giving up your Sunday and being with us today. And I know why. All of you really want to hear the eloquent speaker, Mr. Shashi Tharoor, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Well, I'd like to take you back for a month ago when there were celebrations of late Shri P.V. Narasimha Rao Garu's centenary. After the centenary celebrations, 24th of July last month, our PCC President, Dr. Uttam Kumar Reddy ji, Captain Uttam Kumar Reddy ji, decided that we should celebrate his centenary because he is a son of the soil, the only Prime Minister from the south of the country throughout a year. So for the year-long celebrations, he formed a committee, and I'm fortunate to have been made the chairperson of the centenary celebrations, along with honorary chairperson, Mr. V. Hanumantarao Garu, and vice chairman, Mr. Sridhar Babu. So having started that functional launch, a great launch last month, wherein we had the galaxy of the political fraternity, the former President Sri Pranab Mukherjee and Dr. Manmohan Singh ji, who was our former Prime Minister. Then, of course, there were messages by Srimati Sonia Gandhi ji and Mr. Rahul Gandhi ji. There was Mr. Chidambaram speaking that day, and so was Mr. Jairam Ramesh. So having had a great launch, widely acclaimed, now we are moving on to the second program, that is today. And today we decided, not us ourselves, but the speaker himself. Who else could be the speaker who talk about external affairs and the foreign policy of Sri P.V. Narasimha Rao, but our dynamic, eloquent leader in the parliament, MP from Thiruvananthapuram, Sri Dr. Tharoor ji. Shashi, I call you so many times as Shashi, so getting the Tharoor was a little problem. So it is Dr. Shashi Tharoor today who's taking us through the foreign policy of the late former Prime Minister Sri P.V. Narasimha Rao Garu. To talk about Dr. Shashi Tharoor, he's an author who has authored more than 20 books. And of course, he's very talented. He's also multilingual. He has served in the United Nations for more than 25 to 30 years, if I can remember. He was the Undersecretary to the Secretary General then, Mr. Kofi Annan. And having successfully been an international diplomat, he moved on to an entirely different profession, that is politics. He has contested from Thiruvananthapuram in Kerala 3 times and he has won 3 elections straight, one after the other, and that is itself historic. So he has been a very successful politician and also a successful diplomat. Well, he will be speaking and taking us through the foreign policy of Shri P.V. Narasimha Rao Garu. And there will be moderation, a moderator, Captain Uttam Kumar Reddy ji. Captain Uttam Kumar Reddy ji is our PCC chief for 5 long years, and he's a very dynamic personality. He has been, in the war, a fighter pilot, having been injured. He rested for a while and then he wanted to serve his country in some way, and that's how he joined politics. And he is here today also to moderate and ask questions that we have received from all of you. Having said this, I welcome Kuntiya ji, Bosraj ji, Srinivas ji, and all the other galaxy of people right in front of me. So now I hand over the mic on to Dr. Shashi Tharoor, who will now take us through P.V. Narasimha Rao's foreign policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Geeta. It's a pleasure to join you all today, and I'm gratified that so many of you have logged in on the Sunday afternoon. My special thanks to the Telangana Pradesh Congress Committee, to President Shri Uttam Kumar Reddy, and my dear colleague in the All India Professionals Congress, Srimati Geeta Reddy, for the privilege of offering tribute to the legacy of a colossus of modern India, the late former Prime Minister Shri Narasimha Rao Garu, whose centenary is being celebrated this year. Shri Narasimha Rao has in many ways remained an enigma in the history of our nation. Though he's far from forgotten, as the major commemorations in Telangana and elsewhere confirm, I would argue that the man and his legacy have not been sufficiently understood, including by history writers, and among them many who have not always been kind to him. Let me start by acknowledging that his legacy and the indelible footprint he left on the foundation of our nation remains contested, and not enough has been done to understand the magnitude of his achievements. But let me also argue that if we were to adequately recognize the scale of the innumerable challenges we as a nation were confronted by at the start of the 1990s, if we sufficiently appreciated the perilous nature of the times that India was facing, and if we fairly took stock of decisions that were made at key moments that shaped the India we're so proud of today, then I would argue that in Narasimha Rao, at one of our most difficult periods, India was blessed with an extraordinary statesman and a visionary leader who changed the fortunes of India in an exceptionally transformative way. And he achieved this despite not being a popular mass leader, presiding over a minority government, and as an accidental prime minister, to use a popular phrase now, many of his powerful party colleagues did not trust him. When he took over, India's economy was failing and its geopolitical position was at its weakest. The year 1991 was a tumultuous period in the global order. The Gulf War was raging with the intervention of a global coalition led by the United States, which launched Operation Desert Storm to push back Iraqi forces under Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. In a matter of weeks, Iraq found itself ceding not just Kuwait, but parts of its own territory while retreating from the US Tomahawk missiles. The US won decisively and imposed a harsh peace on the vanquished Saddam. What mattered more to the world that was observing this crisis was the fact that the conflict between two countries responsible at the time for over 4.3 million barrels of oil a day inevitably caused a dramatic shock to the global oil supply. At the peak of the conflict, the price of crude oil doubled overnight, triggering economic rifts within countries that found their oil import bills rising drastically, including India, which was heavily dependent on oil imports for its energy needs. Elsewhere in Asia, Japan, which had steadily developed its economy following the devastation of World War II, was beginning to realize its good run was about to end. Starting with a significant fall in land prices in 1991, the country was staring at what is now recognized as the implosion of the Japanese asset price bubble, a devastating crash in commodities that would dominate the country for much of the next decade. This is known as Japan's lost decade, by the way, a period during which the land of the rising sun struggled to maintain even a paltry rising GDP growth rate of about 1.4%. A similar story was unfolding elsewhere. South America, for example, still recovering from the Latin American debt crisis, where countries like Brazil, Mexico, Argentina found themselves unable to pay back the immense volume of external debt they'd racked up to finance their domestic industrial programs, leading to a prolonged period of economic and political turbulence in these countries. And then finally, as this whole chaotic year in geopolitics wound up, the biggest shock arrived. In December 1991, the USSR, the key friend and partner of India in the global order, was dissolved, and a single federation split up overnight into 15 independent nations. Consumed by its own dramatic metamorphosis, what remained of this former bloc by means of the Russian Federation under newly minted President Boris Yeltsin was naturally far more preoccupied with salvaging the economic devastation it was still reeling from and removing the cobwebs of communism that had brought it there than it did with recapturing the space it had abdicated in the global order. If the global theater was therefore in a state of flux, then the domestic situation in India at the same time was undoubtedly even more grave. As we all know, on the 21st of May 1991, India was brutally robbed of one of her great and most promising sons when a suicide bomber took the life of Rajiv Gandhi, just as he was set to address an election rally in Sri Perumbudur. This tragic event, a terrible repeat of what happened to Srimati Indira Gandhi only 7 years earlier, sent shockwaves across the country and plunged an entire nation into mourning. As if the devastating impact of this tragedy weren't enough, the fact is that it took place at a time when our nation was confronted by a number of other seemingly insurmountable challenges. As a grave editorial in The Economist at the time put it, quote, "The bomb that killed Rajiv Gandhi this week sent its blast through an India already on the edge of tragedy. That is why a single act of political barbarism may yet smash the world's biggest democracy into sectarian fragments," unquote. Today it seems overblown, but to many at that time the implosion seemed imminent. Politically, the stability of the country was all but hanging by a thread, with the coalition governments cobbled together by VP Singh, which lasted only from December 89 to November 90, and Chandrasekhar from November 90 to June 91, barely lasting months before fizzling out. Challenges to national unity and security were gaining momentum in Assam, Punjab, Jammu and Kashmir, where Pakistan was playing an active role in fomenting strife. And certainly compounded by poor economic policy making and conflicting ideas presented by 7 finance ministers in the previous 6 years, the Indian economy was all but teetering on a precipice. In fact, the macroeconomic signals were all in the red. In the decade between 1981 and 1991, India's external debt tripled from $23.5 billion or 195 crores to $63.4 billion. And you can imagine with these kinds of numbers what we could live with. In just the 2 years between 89 and 91, our trade deficit rose by 36%. Our current account deficit by 54%. The rate of inflation practically doubled from 7.5% in 89 to over 13% by 91. And in the process of footing our many bills, our foreign exchange reserves had practically halved by the end of 1990. As many of you know, things got so bad that at one point India barely had the reserves to finance 3 weeks of imports. And there was a strong worry that we would end up defaulting on many of our external liabilities. With Moody's downgrading India's bond ratings, raising funds became all the more difficult. And India was forced to turn to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, for a bailout by humiliatingly staking the better part of our gold reserves as collateral. Can we imagine, for the Indian sensibility, these whole stocks of gold being shipped to London? That's what happened at the fag end of the Chandrasekhar government. Given these circumstances, it was understandable that most of the observing world was anticipating an Indian collapse, almost as if it were an inevitable reality. Pity India was how the New York Times summarized the mood in 1991. And I quote their editorial, "Pity India, not since independence in 1947, has so much conflict beset this huge democracy. A violent election interrupted by the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi has left it without a majority party or a visible leader. Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs are mired in quarrels. Regions clamor for self-rule. Everyone complains about corruption, the economy, and an ossified bureaucracy. If chaos triumphs in India, the tremors won't be contained. Indian disunion would be a calamity for human rights, would fragment markets and accelerate a regional arms race fed by new rivalries, unquote. It wasn't just propaganda being floated by the foreign press, as some supporters of our current ruling dispensation would have been quick to argue if the same suggestion were made today. The image of an India descending into chaos was shared by many concerned Indians, including, for example, the veteran journalist Raj Chengappa, who noted, quote, "There has always been a certain smugness in the way India looked at itself. The myths have been shattered one by one. Instead of a progressive and pragmatic nation, most perceive the country as a trundling rhinoceros, swathed in tons of red tape and trapped in a time warp of its own making," unquote. So given these near existential questions, I took a few minutes over the background, internationally and nationally, for you to appreciate the story I'm going to tell you about foreign policy. Because given the near existential questions that were being asked of the Indian polity and what was at stake, the choice of Pamalaparthi Venkata Narasimha Rao as the 9th Prime Minister of our Republic was not greeted with much optimism across the aisle. Though a veteran administrator in a career that included a tenure as Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh, 7 terms as Member of Parliament, and extensive experience in the cabinet that included stints in the crucial portfolios of external affairs, home, and defense, the question of whether Sri Narasimha Rao was the man capable of leading India out of the darkness that engulfed it was one raised by many, even if only in whispers in the capital, and perhaps understandably so. Would the scholar, intellectual, and polyglot, of whom it was uncharitably said that he was a master at being silent in 10 languages, could he meet the cold calculations and subtle political machinations of overseeing a minority government? Would a leader with no political constituency of his own, no particular caste equation in his favor, nor a massed following, manage to bring a divided India together? Was the choice of this man as PM a conniving piece of political engineering by those who wanted an amenable figure at the top in the vacuum created by Rajiv Gandhi's demise? And finally, could a man who was set on his own retirement and had announced his departure from the public sphere just ahead of the elections, could he ensure that the newly minted government would not meet a similar fate as the 2 that preceded it, each of which failed to last a year? If these were the questions raised in 1991, over the course of the next 5 years, they were met with thorough answers. P.V. Narasimha Rao, the country was blessed with an unlikely champion, who displayed his credentials as a masterful administrator and political tactician to lead India through one of its most turbulent phases. Whether it was through his capacity to implement revolutionary reforms, aided by the formidable Dr. Manmohan Singh, or through his delicate maneuvering that ensured a remained in office for the full term, or by changing the very perception of India to the outside world through his tenure in office, Narasimha Rao Garu was a force unto himself that resoundingly proved his detractors wrong. As Kapil Komireddy rightly characterizes in his excellent book, Malevolent Republic, A Short History of New India, and I quote, "It is now de rigueur to credit Manmohan Singh, who became finance minister in 1991, with India's rapid metamorphosis. But in a country where economic isolation was an inviolable ideological axiom, putting Singh's prescriptions into action was a distinctly political challenge. The man who shouldered this responsibility was an unlikely figure. He was 70 and had undergone triple bypass surgery when he became prime minister. A career politician, he had no political constituency of his own. There was hardly a voice that did not lament his rise to the top. And yet, if Nehru discovered India, it can reasonably be said that P.V. Narasimha Rao reinvented it, unquote. Now, don't get me wrong, both Narasimha Rao and Dr. Manmohan Singh deserve every bit of praise for their contributions in liberalizing the economy. And it certainly helped that they had an extremely close partnership which ensured that such reforms could be supported by the necessary political backing. Would a technocratic finance minister have steered such a major economic transformation without the political cover provided by a shrewd prime minister? Dr. Manmohan Singh himself does not think so. As Narasimha Rao acknowledged when speaking about his partnership with Dr. Singh, when he gets into political trouble, I bail him out. When I get into economic trouble, he bails me out. While much can be said about the economic reforms that form the crux of this reinvention, for the purpose of this discussion today, I've been asked to attempt to offer an analysis of the brand of foreign policy that Narasimha Rao established during his tenure in office. The background was essential, but I want to say that during these times, the Narasimha Rao government articulated a distinctly unique set of priorities, each of which, including foreign policy, placed the domestic development concerns of India at its core. Rao's raw political instincts and his 2 terms as foreign minister in earlier governments made him unnatural in the realm of foreign policy. Vinay Sitapati, the author of a superb biography, Half Lion, gives Rao credit for a realistic assessment of shifting powers as evident in his outreach to the US, Israel, Iran, and East Asia. The new post-Cold War global environment and the weakness of the Indian economy made peace a prudent choice, and reaching out to the triumphant US as the sole superpower in a newly unipolar world, a strategic choice. He quickly won the support of the Western powers against Pakistan's promotion of terrorism and militancy in Kashmir, which was essential for us given the collapse of the Soviet Union, which had been India's international protector. Under his sage tutelage, India was also able to surmount multiple pressures on a wide range of issues, including non-proliferation, establish diplomatic relations with Israel, launch the Look East policy for East Asia, a region overlooked by previous governments, and recast the priorities of India's diplomacy from some of the preachy moralism of non-alignment to the purposeful pursuit of economic interests that led to India becoming a serious investment destination. How then did he reconcile all of this with the tallest pillar of India's foreign policy, non-alignment? Narasimha Rao engineered major changes in foreign policy as India established good relations with incompatible nations like the US and Russia, Israel and the Arabs, Iran and even Pakistan. This was first seen through his articulation of the Look East policy, which developed the foundations for closer economic ties between India and countries in Southeast Asia and East Asia. To be sure, the prospect was not a novel proposition, but the manner in which Narasimha Rao built on the vision of closer synthesis between India and its neighbors in Asia, as described by his distinguished predecessors, is certainly worth recognizing. Many of you have had the opportunity to read Jawaharlal Nehru's great classic, The Discovery of India, would be aware of his reference to Southeast Asia as Greater India. That heady romanticism foundered amid mutual suspicions during the Cold War, and relations remained distant. The end of the superpower standoff, and thus of the obligation of states to determine their international allegiances in relation to Cold War loyalties and commitments, widened India's foreign policy options, permitting New Delhi to look beyond the conventional wisdom of its non-aligned years. Look East followed. Initially aimed at improving relations with the countries of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, at a time when India had embarked upon economic liberalization, and indirectly at enhancing strategic cooperation with the United States, looking east to look west, as the author Sunanda Datta Ray termed it, the policy remains a bedrock of Indian foreign policy today, 2 decades after it first took off. 3 decades almost. it's instructive that no Indian political party, and several have had turns at government since Narasimha Rao, has questioned either the underpinnings or the manifestations of the Lucky's policy. One factor helping drive the policy was undoubtedly China's early interest in the region. During the Cold War, Southeast Asia saw itself threatened by the risk of communist expansion. But once China opened up its economy to the outside world and became a major trading power, the prospects of military adventurism by Beijing receded. Nonetheless, China's growing economic and military might, for all its talk of a peaceful rise, cast a shadow over a region that had traditionally been wary of Beijing. India's interest in engaging with the region more deeply offered the nations of Southeast Asia the prospect of a democratic and non-threatening counterbalance. For years, India had been bogged down in its own neighborhood and dismissed by most, especially by Beijing, as at best a subcontinental power. Look East began with trade, but soon expanded to include diplomatic dialogue and strategic and military cooperation. It helped that both sides of the equation enjoyed a shared colonial experience, cultural affinities going back to antiquity, and despite the estrangement of the Cold War years, a striking lack of historical resentments to come between them. Between 1992, Narasimha Rao made visits to Japan, responsible for the largest tranche of development assistance to India at the time, South Korea, Indonesia, and Thailand. Vietnam and Singapore followed in 1994, and finally Malaysia in 1995. Throughout his travels, the economic underpinnings of the message he carried to these lands was made abundantly clear. India was now open for business. And in doing business with India, these countries would find a natural partner and ally in the subcontinent, a partner with whom they already shared many common cultural, social, and geopolitical similarities. It was a message that was received with much optimism in these countries and formed the fulcrum through which these relationships had been further developed through successive governments in both countries. The success in purely economic terms was highlighted by Dr. Manmohan Singh when he addressed the 5th India-ASEAN Summit in January 2007 as the then Prime Minister. He said India's trade with ASEAN has risen from just $2.4 billion in 1990 to $23 billion in 2005, and our trade with the countries of the East Asia Summit has similarly risen to account for nearly 1/3 of our external trade. But the relationship was not just one that has been driven by these percentages alone. While trade has steadily increased over the years, and Dr. Manmohan Singh's figure is out of date because trade with ASEAN today is at $81.3 billion, the potential of economic cooperation has arguably not been fully met, since services trade has still not grown commensurately. But it has certainly developed other dimensions, including in the avenues of defense cooperation, geopolitical alliances, including thriving bilateral relations and cultural exchanges. But equally, as Dr. Singh recognized, quotes, the Look East policy is much more than an external economic policy. It reflects a changed understanding of India's role in the world economy and signals a significant strategic shift in India's vision of international affairs. That is Narasimha Rao's contribution. If Narasimha Rao laid the foundations for a thriving relationship with these partners in the East, he was also acutely aware of the need to manage a more delicate situation close to our borders, the challenge of the dragon, very familiar to us at this time. India's relations with China had already at the time seen a thaw since the 1962 conflict, thanks to Rajiv Gandhi's path-breaking visit to Beijing in 1988. But the concern of Chinese incursions was a prospect that Indians could hardly afford to forget. This, coupled with the growing closeness between China and Pakistan, including through the transfer of nuclear weapons technology and allied know-how that allowed the latter to successfully become a nuclear state, meant that the Chinese relationship was one that required delicate management. China became arguably the key relationship he improved dramatically. Narasimha Rao was greatly impressed with Deng Xiaoping and thought his expertise lay in giving a new direction to Chinese political philosophy without making a break with the past, something that he himself was doing in India. Rao adopted a conciliatory yet guarded approach towards China. Despite a cautionary note from a former Indian ambassador to China, marking democratic and pluralist ways as anathema to the visiting Chinese Prime Minister Li Peng, Rao thought that he is still the man we must do business, at least for a little more time to come. And so he was very pragmatic to address the principal challenge in the relationship, the disputed line of actual control. Narasimha Rao displayed remarkable geopolitical dexterity in finding a mutually acceptable solution that addressed the issue by not addressing it. This came through the signing of the Agreement on the Maintenance of Peace and Tranquility along the India-China border areas during his visit to China in 1993. This was widely regarded at the time as Asia's first major agreement on conventional military disagreement. I beg your pardon, I'll repeat that. This was widely regarded at the time as Asia's first major agreement on conventional military disengagement. But why was it special? Through the agreement, both sides agreed to dehyphenate the issue of the contested land boundary with the rest of the relationship between the two countries, along with a mutually agreed set of restrictions on usage of airspace and military presence in contested areas. The agreement allowed both countries to finally develop a much broader relationship by essentially sidestepping the question of the contested border. At the same time, both countries agreed to embark on confidence-building measures rooted in the principle of mutual and equal security, which allowed the countries to disengage from border contestations and move towards a more confident and assured relationship. Subsequently, the military version of these principles were also enshrined in the 1996 Agreement on Military Confidence-Building Measures. Apart from allowing India to develop closer economic ties with China, coinciding with the opening up of our economy, this agreement ensured a peaceful adherence to the status quo for a significant period of time. According to his biographer Vinay Sitapati, the border agreements with China showed a prime minister who had learned, perhaps from his own domestic weakness, to set aside unresolvable conflicts and focus on common interests. The veteran diplomat Shiv Shankar Menon certainly concurs, quote, "Did the 1993 border peace agreement serve its purpose? It certainly has, in terms of keeping the peace and the status quo almost a quarter century, and in terms of the various agreements that have made the India-China border one of the most peaceful ones India has." This is when Shiv Shankar Menon was writing a few years ago. At a time of financial and economic stress and transition for the Indian economy, India managed to keep defense expenditures low. And the agreement was only one factor, if a major one, making this possible. Others included the decision to become an overt nuclear weapon state. But the point is that the agreement served and was seen by others as serving India's strategic interest in peace, unquote. Now, there were a number of other areas where the foreign policy of Narasimha Rao is widely regarded as path-breaking. His pragmatism was visible in Rao's simultaneous suspicion of Pakistani intentions while keeping the conversation flowing with Islamabad, even while India was warding off the militancy in Kashmir, financed and deployed from across the border. Relations with India's neighbors were also adroitly kept on an even keel. As part of a general reorientation of Indian foreign policy, including closer ties with the United States, which I'll come back to, in 1992, the Narasimha Rao government decided to upgrade diplomatic relations with Israel to full ambassadorial level, a previously unthinkable prospect given India's close relations with the Arab world. But in Narasimha Rao, the country had a leader capable of balancing fraught identities and sensitivities through calculated moves. As Kapil Komireddy highlights, events were set into motion during the visit of influential Jewish leader Isi Libela, who met privately with Narasimha Rao in 1991. The main request he brought with him was for India to vote in favor of overturning the upcoming UN Resolution 3379, which equated Zionism with racism. Recognizing the utility of a potential partnership with Israel, India voted to repeal the resolution, despite having voted for it previously, and indeed having voted against the very creation of the Israeli state in the UN General Assembly. At the same time, Narasimha Rao made a concerted effort to reach out to India's partners in the Arab world, particularly Palestine, whose leader Yasser Arafat was invited to Delhi as a guest of the state. Through a well-reasoned deliberation with Arafat, Narasimha Rao was able to get his tacit consent, paving the way for an official upgrade in ties between India and Israel. The foundation laid in the process of these delicate plays by Narasimha Rao certainly resulted in a fruitful partnership. The last 2 decades have witnessed a steady strengthening of the India-Israel partnership, particularly in the defense and security areas, where the two countries' shared concerns about Islamic extremism have offered common ground for cooperation. And that brings me to the final example, the pivotal role that Narasimha Rao played in revitalizing relations between India and the United States of America. As India opened up her economy, the need for new partners and investments was widely felt as a necessary condition to sustain and drive the economic reforms proposed by the Narasimha Rao government. With the demise of the USSR and the creation of a unipolar world order, as I've mentioned, India could hardly afford to ignore the United States, which potentially stood to offer the necessary investment and support our country now needed. But this was easier said than done. There were, after all, a number of factors that had placed obstacles in the path of this relationship. These range from Indira Gandhi's intervention in Bangladesh in 1971 over the opposition of President Nixon, to India's perceived closeness to the USSR, the nuclear question, and allegations of human rights violations in Kashmir. On India's side, the partnership between the United States and Pakistan in pushing back the Soviets in Afghanistan, which involved significant military support and aid flowing into our next-door neighbor, remained a key concern, among others. But Narasimha Rao recognized that such misgivings of the past needed to be set aside, and a thriving relationship could help India realize many of its domestic priorities. This is precisely what he set out to do and eventually managed to accomplish. After acutely and astutely managing the sensitive Indo-Israel relationship, and thereby winning the support of influential Jewish lobbies in America, Narasimha Rao embarked on a path-breaking visit to the US in 1994, in a 6-day trip that included stops not just in Washington, but in New York, Houston, and Boston. Accompanied by Dr. Manmohan Singh and a formidable group of established Indian business leaders, Narasimha Rao carried a common assurance into all of his meetings in America. India's economic reforms were here to stay, and America would do well to recognize and support the indisputable potential that was beginning to open up in India. Powerful players like the India Interest Group, a lobby of 26 American industrial groups interested in coming to India, certainly helped push the needle in the right direction. While India needed the United States on its side to keep the economic reforms going.
Namaskaram.
Yes, hello, Uttam. Can I carry on? I have just a few minutes to go. It could not afford to give in to US pressure on non-proliferation and compromise what he saw as India's national security interests by limiting its nuclear program. Of course, this meant that during his tenure, some concessions were made by both sides. India agreed to put the brakes on any plans to conduct nuclear tests during Narasimha Rao's tenure. But he quietly kept the nuclear program going while India's economic growth, spearheaded by his economic reforms, translated into a new status which the US could not afford to ignore. In the process, he set the stage for the Vajpayee government's 1998 nuclear tests. The subtle but unmistakable progress was distinctly there in Narasimha Rao, whose mettle and self-assured demeanor would go on to surprise all who crossed his path. As the cover story in India Today noted, quote, clearly the most potent weapon was Rao himself. Serious, experienced, and mature, he wears the mantle of a statesman, a man who means business and is not interested in wasting unnecessary time on trivialities. In public, he comes across as a diminutive figure, his bald head and drab grey Nehru suits more appropriate to a communist commissar than the leader of the world's largest emerging free market. In private meetings, however, he's in his element, giving the impression of solid confidence, flexible yet firm, a man who understands the post-Cold War scenario better than most, and more important, India's potential to play a bigger role than blinkered policies have allowed it to in the past, unquote. As the world moved away from the hubris of the Cold War era, from a period dominated by two power blocs to a world where the concept and spirit of globalization had begun to take root. India was certainly fortunate to have a leader like Narasimha Rao to guide our ship through uncharted waters. A polyglot who had mastery over no one knows how many languages. Biographers use varying numbers, 12, 15, even 17. He had an uncanny ability to convey India's aspirations and priorities to the rest of the world, even literally in multiple languages sometimes. And an anecdote shared in Kapil Komi Reddy's book. To his colleagues, quote, Rao remained an enigma, a man who was fluent in a dozen languages, but they complained spoke his mind in none. Visiting Havana in 1980, he received instructions from Indira to persuade the leaders of the non-aligned movement to move their next summit from Iraq, then at war with Iran, to India. Rao disarmed the gathering by arguing India's case in Spanish to the Cubans, Persian to the Iranians, Arabic to the Iraqis and Egyptians, French to a host of African representatives, and Urdu to the Pakistanis. Unquote. Throughout his tenure in office, the former Prime Minister had a remarkable commitment towards the goal of integrating India within the global order and a recognition that such an adventure was key to unlocking the inherent potential of our nation and with it, an empowered standard of living for her people. I know I'm already over time. Uttam has already interrupted me. But let me wrap up by saying, as a masterful administrator and shrewd tactician, Narasimha Rao was an individual capable of making decisions with the full awareness of the sensitivities involved, and yet driven by a determination to secure outcomes that he believed stood at the core of India's national priorities. Regarded by those who understood him as a contemporary Kautilya, through his actions, Narasimha Rao was instrumental in unleashing a revitalized India at the turn of the 21st century. Any cause he held dear, there was simply no obstacle large enough that could keep this titan away from securing goals that he deemed to be important for his country. But perhaps most important, at the heart of his brand of leadership lay a firm appreciation for the aspirations of the people he led and a determination to put their concerns above all else. Power for the sake of power mattered little to our Narasimha Rao, but the willingness to set aside our differences and work to liberate the spirits of our common humanity most certainly did. I've quoted so many others, let me quote him once. Power, he said, in its most conventional sense, cannot be balanced when nations are dependent upon each other. We must visualize instead a world where the individual power of nations aggregate a common global collective power, which can address itself to the resolution of problems which have consistently preoccupied the mind of man. Such power must be defined not in indices of force or the strength of numbers, but by the human and material potential with which each nation is blessed, unquote. And Narasimha Rao said this at the SAARC summit in Colombo. Under him, the foreign policy of India moved decisively away from pure Nehruvian idealism to a more pragmatic pursuit of national self-interest. The analyst C. Rajamohan compared it to crossing the Rubicon. Yet Rao represented continuity with India's traditional Nehruvian foreign policy approach, despite his policy inventions and deviations. With China, for instance, he delinked the irreconcilable border dispute from other aspects of the bilateral relationship. Just as he kept dialogue with Pakistan going, even while the Kashmir insurgency was raging at its peak. Significantly, for a country trying to recover from the economic dregs, this helped keep India's defense expenditure through the troubled 1990s to an affordable 2.4 to 2.8% of GDP. The essential elements of renouncing force to settle border disputes and upholding the status quo echoed Nehru's words and therefore won the support of diehard Nehruvians. Prime Minister Narasimha Rao's New Year greeting card for the year 1992 read, "Change is the only constant." Change is the only constant. The card depicted the sketch of a spinning wheel gradually transforming into a mechanical gear, symbol of the evolution of tradition and not of its abandonment. That image, as we celebrate the rich foreign policy legacy of PV Narasimha Rao, lies the secret of his remarkable success and a reminder of all that we have to thank this underappreciated leader. This is why I too support your resolution demanding a Bharat Ratna for this true jewel of India. Thank you. Jai Hind.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tharoor.
Apologies for running so much over time. I'm sorry.
No, it
You
was-
had to interrupt me.
No, we did not interrupt you. I think there was some kind of a problem there. But
Oh, I see.
we could have gone on listening to you. It was so enlightening. And now I give over the mic to our PCC President, Captain Uttam Kumar Reddy ji, to carry on with the question and answers. Thank you very much.
Dr. Shashi Tharoor ji, as usual, it's a great pleasure, a privilege to hear you. It was a brilliant talk, scintillating, educative, informative. Thank you very much, sir, for the wonderful talk. And sorry, I didn't interrupt you. Somebody whose phone was not muted accidentally came online, and we said it right. So once again,
Yes,
sir,
thank
thanking you.
That's okay. I didn't cut out too much to save time. So we have covered all the essential issues.
Okay, sir.
I'd be very happy to take any
With those of you in the audience here and on Zoom app and Facebook Live, I will very briefly share my personal experiences with PV Narasimha Rao garu. After serving as a fighter pilot in the Indian Air Force on MiG-21s and MiG-23s, my fighter aircraft exploded close to line of control and I ejected from a MiG-23. I was posted then to Rashtrapati Bhavan for some years. The some years got extended and I stayed for a long time. I was in the Rashtrapati Bhavan from 1988 to 1994. So I have seen the prime ministerships of Rajiv ji, then VP Singh, then Chandrasekhar, and then PV Narasimha Rao as a prime minister till I resigned from government service and came into public life in 94. PV Narasimha Rao garu was also well known to our family, and he was very happy and proud that a young Telangana son was in Rashtrapati Bhavan, and he used to interact with me quite a bit both as a cabinet minister and when he was a prime minister. In fact, I remember one particular visit when along with President R. Venkatraman, we went to Tokyo to attend Emperor Hirohito's funeral. And Sri P.V. Narasimha Rao garu had accompanied as accompanying cabinet minister. I think he was also the foreign minister at that time. And we were, talking for a long time. So on a personal level also, I mean, me and my family used to know P.V. Narasimha Rao quite well. And of course, there are many here in this audience who know him much better. Shashi Tharoor ji will be interested to know that Sridhar Babu here with us, his family is from the same constituency as P.V. Narasimha Rao, and his father represented the same assembly constituency, and now Sridhar represents the same assembly constituency as P.V. Narasimha Rao did as a four-term MLA. Dr. Geeta Reddy's mother was a very close follower of Sri P.V. Narasimha Rao. Mr. V. Hanumantrao, sitting with us today, was a PCC president of combined Andhra Pradesh when P.V. Narasimha Rao as Prime Minister contested for Lok Sabha from Nandyal in Andhra Pradesh. Dr. Malu Ravi as MP also knew him, so many of us knew him personally also. And there's been a huge response to your talk. We are flooded with questions, but both mine and we'll limit it to just a few of them. Sir, the one question that has come from several participants in this Zoom app and Facebook Live meet is, how do you compare the foreign policy handling of P.V. Narasimha Rao vis-a-vis neighboring countries to that of Modi now? I mean, without being politically biased, under Mr. Narendra Modi, we have had a confrontation on the Indo-China border. After 45 years, somebody has died in a border skirmish. Then we have been close to the edge of a war with Pakistan. Nepal has actually showed our territory as theirs. I mean, I find it really audacious of Nepalese parliament to pass such a bill or act or whatever, with a map showing Indian territory as theirs. Then Sri Lanka, I mean, whatever we can make out, the Rajapaksa brothers seem to be totally with China. And then Bangladesh also has been miffed with India on and off, because I still remember after the CA bill was passed in Parliament, the Bangladeshi foreign minister called off the visit to India. I don't think we have great relations with Afghanistan too. And so, generally, I mean, with your knowledge as a UN diplomat and your vast experience in public life, what would you say that when we had a very decent relationship with our neighbors right through, and especially under people like Mr. P.V. Narasimha Rao, why have our relations with neighbors deteriorated so much and in such a short time? Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Uttam. I must say your summary of the state of our current relationships in the neighborhood is spot on. We have unfortunately managed to get one of the friendliest sort of fraternal countries for us, Nepal, onto the other side. They are now more than flirting with China while having a confrontational relationship with us. Of course, Pakistan is completely antagonistic, and our government's policies haven't helped. China, we've lost 20 lives on the Galwan Valley. Maldives, we had a terrible time until a recent election produced a more receptive government. But before that, they used to advertise jobs 2 years ago saying Indians need not apply. Sri Lanka, of course, we were identified as being against the Rajapaksas. Now the Rajapaksas have come to power. We have been scrambling to try and recover that relationship. Bangladesh was a good and close relationship, but sadly, our outgoing High Commissioner could not even get an appointment with the President for the last 3 months of her tenure, after the Home Minister made a speech saying that Bangladeshis are termites. Now, all of this kind of situation gives you the answer already. The reason things are so bad today is first a divisive, ideologically driven and arrogant politics, which our neighbors pay attention to. Second, the huge difference in personality between the arrogance of the current leadership in our country and the quiet, understated, humble approach of Narasimha Rao Garu. And finally, the very great differences of approach and temperament. I've talked about how Narasimha Rao was pragmatic. Narasimha Rao wanted to change things without seeming to be changing anything. You never hear a speech from him saying that, oh, the previous foreign policy was bad, I'm changing everything. He portrayed everything and behaved as if everything was a continuation of the past. But at the same time, he brought about fundamental changes quietly and soundly. And he knew the art of how to relate to the neighborhood in an asymmetrical fashion. That is to show these other countries that India will give more than it takes. Unfortunately, we have the opposite right now. For example, in the confrontation with Nepal over their new constitution, it looked like India was demanding more from Nepal than Nepal could feasibly give. Now, that is not the approach by a big country to small countries. We can't afford to forget that if we sit around the table with our South Asian neighbors, including Pakistan, we account for 70% of the collective population and 80% of the collective GDP. So we can't even move our hands without essentially pushing into somebody else's space. It's natural. Any big country has this problem with its neighbors. If you look at the United States, there's a wonderful classic line a century ago from the then Mexican president Porfirio Diaz, who said, "My poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States." So I'm sure many of our smaller neighbors are thinking the same thing, that they are completely in the shadow of India. Well, we have to acknowledge this and go out of our way to be reasonable, conciliatory, and accommodative, and anything but arrogant and anything but pushing our weight around. Sadly, this is where the present regime has failed, and this is where Narasimha Rao succeeded.
Okay, so the second question. Now, sir, in the earlier years, probably even in the time of Mr. P.V. Narasimha Rao, India was always close to the erstwhile USSR. And we were always a little distant from the US. We were much closer, we were a non-aligned country, but we were much closer to the USSR than we were to the US. Now, over some time, and especially in Mr. Narendra Modi's government, we seem to be hugging the American presidents all the time. And I can tell you, as a former fighter pilot who flew Russian fighter aircraft in the Air Force, that the Russians seem to have turned a little cold to us. And I think even to an extent where the Russian and Pakistani military forces are doing combined exercises together now. And I think after the recent Indo-Chinese conflict, the Russian reaction was, it is for those two countries to, talk and sort out issues. They never gave a statement in our favor. So, do you think that our trying to go too close to the US has actually proved counterproductive to us?
Thank you, Uttam. I think it's a very important and interesting question. Please remember that Narasimha Rao had the opposite problem. When he became Prime Minister, relations with the US were quite negative and hostile. And for him, it was a challenge to kind of bring them back into an even keel, which he was able to do without disrupting the Russian relationship because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia at that point was not focusing on foreign policy as a priority. Indeed, I can confirm I used to be sitting in the UN Security Council quietly as a Secretariat staff member in those days. And if you close your eyes and just heard the English language soundtrack, the Russian ambassador often sounded like the American. So the Russians were not at that point offering a distinctive take it or leave it, us or the Americans kind of approach. And that Narasimha Rao, therefore, was able to very successfully maneuver us back into the US good books, open up relations with Israel, open up relations with the East Asian countries and so on in a very significant way without having to worry about offending the Russians. That was certainly a more difficult challenge in the era of Narendra Modi for two reasons, because Mr. Putin's Russia has become more assertive than Mr. Yeltsin's Russia was, number one. And number two, because we have a genuine problem with the Chinese, because China has become more assertive than in the days of the so-called peaceful rise with Narasimha Rao, who was seeing only the early phase off. So I think it would be unfair to praise Narasimha Rao and blame Narendra Modi on this alone, because the circumstances and the geopolitical surroundings are very different. Having said that, we have to tread a very delicate tightrope, because the Russians are seeing more and more that their geopolitical interests lie in alignment with China. And even though they are still our most important and significant supplier of weapons and spare parts for weapons and fighter planes and ships and so on, about 60%, I think, the fact still is that for them, China is more important than India. And if China tells them we need to cooperate with Pakistan, the Russians will give it importance, not because they love Pakistan particularly, but because they value their new emerging partnership with China. One could even say an alliance with China, because it is developing all the characteristics of an alliance. In those circumstances, you rightly pointed out, the Russians conducted a military exercise for the first time ever on Pakistani soil, and they even spent some time in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, which is a blatant violation of India's sovereignty, while they claim to be a friend of India. Now, the Pakistanis are going to Russia for a joint military exercise with Russia and China, and India was also invited. India had initially agreed, but in the aftermath of the horrible incidents in the line of actual control, India said, we cannot play the game of business as usual with the Chinese, so we are pulling out. Now, if India pulls out, what is the signal it sends? That Russia, China, and Pakistan will conduct military exercises together. Who can it be against? Even if they're doing it with a fictional or hypothetical enemy. India is obviously the country that both China and Pakistan would have in mind, and Russia, by doing this, has signaled a willingness to go along. The old Russia would have said, India cannot participate because of the bilateral tensions with China. Therefore, to my two friends, let us postpone the exercise to a more propitious time when all four countries can participate. But Narendra Modi's diplomacy has failed to deliver such a result. Instead, Russia is going ahead with just China and Pakistan, and that is a very major setback. I think that suggests the perception that India has in the eyes of these countries gone too close to the US, and therefore there is going to be a sense that the strategic autonomy that India has always privileged back from 1947 onwards, that we make our own foreign policy decisions, we have good relations and partnerships with all countries, but we do not put all our strategic eggs in one country's basket, that will have to be now seriously re-questioned, because the perception now is that our strategies are more aligned with the US and are no longer fully autonomous. And that could certainly create, as your question rightly implied, Uttam, an absolute risk of things getting worse with Russia, particularly in the context of their increasing closeness to China and Pakistan.
Thank you, sir. I think this what I'll ask next is probably the last question. So you've been at United Nations for some years. Now, there has been a talk about India being given a permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council. This has been going on for quite some time. What do you think have been the efforts of India so far, and do you think it's a realistic possibility that India will become a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council?
Here I don't blame India, frankly, or any Indian government, starting with Narasimha Rao's government, because he was Prime Minister when the objection was first articulated by Boutros Ghali, the Secretary General, in 1992, who said that by the time of the 50th anniversary of the UN in 1995, he expected and wanted Security Council reform to be accomplished. Well, as we know, the 50th anniversary came and went, the 60th has gone and gone, the 70th has gone, and now we're facing the 75th anniversary in October, and I don't think there's going to be any UN Security Council reform even by the 80th. So why is that happening? You can't blame Indian diplomacy alone. I think there's absolutely no question in my mind that the diplomats of India have tried very hard, but they have found it very difficult to square the circle for two main reasons. The first is, of course, that to change the composition of the Security Council, you need to amend the UN Charter, and amending the UN Charter is a very high bar to leap over. You need a two-thirds majority of the General Assembly, that's 128 countries out of 193. And then you need that resolution to be adopted or ratified, which is usually a parliamentary process, by two-thirds of the member states, including all 5 permanent members. In other words, you not only need a formula acceptable to most of the world, but you need a formula that is not objected to by the very countries whose powers you wish to dilute. So that has turned out to be a very, very huge bar, and that is the first big problem. The second big problem is that since obviously India cannot get in alone, it has to get in with other countries. But all the countries that are talked about have aroused enmity or jealousy in third countries. So the result is that if India wants to be a permanent member, Pakistan and to some degree Indonesia are not keen on it. And certainly China is absolutely hostile to it. If you look at Japan wanting to be a permanent member, China doesn't want it. If you're looking at Germany wanting to be a member, the other European countries say, why Germany? Italy jokes, we lost the war too. If you look at Brazil, then Argentina and Mexico say, we are also significant Latin American countries. What is more, Brazil can't be a true permanent member from our region because they speak a language none of us speak. The whole majority language of the region is Spanish and Brazil is Portuguese speaking. So you see, each of the possible contenders have a rival. And in the case of Africa, they were so unable to agree on one name, they insist on 2 permanent seats. And they're talking of possibly Nigeria and South Africa, but then Egypt is saying, we are the oldest civilization in Africa, how can you leave us out? So the inability to agree on which country should benefit in the event of any Security Council reform is also a very, very serious factor that impedes a solution. And this is why the sort of open-ended working group has failed to come up with it's been a never-ending debate in that working group. And now, after 28 years of establishing a process to reform the Council, the widespread perception is the Council will not be easily reformed. I think the big danger of that for the United Nations is very simply this, that as far as the UN is concerned, it is only able to be effective as long as it is seen as legitimate. So when the Security Council imposes sanctions on some countries, all the other countries in the world have to observe them. They have to see these sanctions as legitimate. But legitimacy comes from a perception that you are a representative and universally accepted body. That was true for about 40, 50 years after the Second World War. But for how long can you consider the Security Council legitimate when it reflects the geopolitical realities of 1945 and not of 2025? This is where you're going to have a serious problem. I can well imagine a situation in the next few years where, for example, a UN Security Council imposes, say, sanctions on one of our neighbors or on a country with which we have vital and significant trade relations. And a country like India says, we weren't consulted in this decision. We don't agree, and we are not going to observe the sanctions. That would mark the beginning of the end for the United Nations Security Council, because if a country like India, which is too powerful, too large to ignore, or in Latin America, Brazil, or in East Asia, Japan, flouts a decision of the Security Council, then the Security Council's credibility goes along with its legitimacy. So I would say to those countries, if you want to preserve the United Nations, you want to keep it viable, you have to make it relevant for the 21st century, then you do need to rethink the composition of the Security Council, and India needs to be on it. So that is a challenge for India, whoever is in power. So I won't take that as a comparison of Narasimha Rao versus Narendra Modi, but rather as a challenge for any Indian government to be able to deliver results. It's going to be very difficult and challenging, but we need to work hard on it in the years to come.
Thank you very much, sir. There are a large number of other questions too, but our time doesn't permit us anymore. Now,
Uttam, I'm pleased to say that having read many of the questions on the chat, I would say 80% of them, particularly the ones about the economic reform, globalization, etc., and their connection to foreign policy, have been answered in the first 20 minutes of my talk. So I would encourage those who ask those questions later to go back and listen to the beginning of my talk. They will get their answer right there.
okay, sir. Now there will be a few other speakers. I request all the speakers to please restrict themselves to 3 minutes so that we can finish on time. Now, Dr. Geeta Reddy will, you want me to call? Now, Dr. Ramchandra Kuntia ji, AACC in charge Telangana, senior leader, former Rajya Sabha member. He is taking part from Bhubaneswar. Sir, we request you to share your thoughts on the occasion. I'll be grateful if all the speakers can be very brief. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, PPCC President, Captain Uttam Kumar Reddy Garu, Chief Guest, ex-Foreign Minister, ex-Secretary UNO, respected Shashi Tharoor ji, Member of Parliament, Sri P.V. Manohar Rao Garu, the brother of P.V. Narasimha Rao Garu, Srimati Geeta Reddy Garu, the chairperson of the P.V. Narasimha Rao Celebration Committee, CLP leader Bhatti Vikrama Garu, ex-PCC President Hanumanta Rao Garu, Punala Lasmaya Garu, Vice Chairman of the committee, Sridhar Babu, and all working president, office bearers, DCC presidents, frontal heads, and friends. I think as the Secretary UNO and as the ex-Foreign Minister, he has given a detailed outline of the Indian foreign policy in the regime of P.V. Narasimha Rao. I think no person can say better than him. So, as the in charge of Telangana on behalf of AICC, I congratulate him and also thank him for the excellent presentation, which is very much convincing what has happened in P.V. Narasimha Rao regime. However, I must also add something. Maybe it's repetition also because he has mentioned all the points which was required. Anyhow, in the year of 1991, heralded an epoch-making era with Cold War coming to an end. Soviet Union collapsed. India's one-time very close ally came to be a thing of past. America was the market leader, and India was under pressure to adjust with a new global environment, that is market economy. Rao government opened up Indian market for foreign investment. A market-determined exchange system was introduced for the first time after independence, and FDI increased significantly. When Rao government decided to go for market economy, it naturally attract the American and other investors to India. In 1995, a US-India Commercial Alliance, USICA, was created. In the same year, United States declared India as a big emerging market. The visit of China Premier, what has been mentioned by him also earlier, in December 91, was the starting point of the whole discussion on the border. So both the US and China, which are the two major powers in post-Cold War, he took the initiative almost immediately. This can be said to be one of the most important aspects of Rao's foreign policy. In 1993, Prime Minister visited China and alleviated some of the bitterness in relation with Nepal. India signed Mahakali Treaty towards the government, towards the hydroelectricity and its export to India, which improved the relation with Nepal. In 95, India, along with other countries of SAARC, signed the South Asian Preferential Trade Agreement, that is SAPTA. With Sri Lanka, the government engaged in economic diplomacy and announced some joint ventures. India looks East policy was for the first time pursued by Narasimha Rao government. Under this policy, India focused its attention towards Southeast Asia, which was not long neglected during the Cold War period. This policy was further cemented by the successive prime ministers and now converted into Act East policy by the current government. The first country visited was Germany. He was quick to recognize the importance of German in Europe from Indian point of view. It was an extremely sagacious move because India needed technology, investment, market access, and Germany was one of the countries with which India had good relations. Like Germany, India wanted to become a member of UN Security Council, about which Honorable Shashi Tharoor has already mentioned. Therefore, to identify Germany as a country that will first go to, when you look back, it was very wise decision. Rao once requested Vajpayee to represent India at a union conference. The two worked closely together. Their thinking were very similar. They had very good personal equation. I think Rao's success was partly because he was able to keep the single largest opposition party on his side till December 1992. In case of Israel, he pursued Yasser Arafat, what Shashi Tharoor ji has already mentioned, during later visit to Delhi to virtually endorse India's outreach to Israel, overturning a 40 years policy on Israel. Rao understood that the Jewish lobby was very powerful, and so by establishing diplomatic relation with Israel, he was actually sending a message to America about India's position to strengthen bilateral relations. In so far look East policy is concerned, which Rao launched in 1992, he was also the first Indian PM to visit South Korea, as South Korea became one of the major investors in India. Today, South Korean brands are all over the country, and it all happens after 1991. In a sense, the entire post-Cold War foreign policy of India can be said, crafted by Narasimha Rao Garu, who was the Prime Minister of India, and on the celebration of his 100 years birth anniversary, I once again pay my humble, respectful tribute to that great leader who has done a lot for this country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Again, enlightening us. So much to say about Shri P.V. Narasimha Rao Garu, because we could go on and on about it. I'm very, very honored and very pleased. I think all of us are here to see Shri P.V. Manohar Rao Garu so diligently sitting and listening all about his elder brother, Shri P.V. Narasimha Rao Garu. Namaskaram andi Manohar Rao Garu. Request chestanu, మీరు కూడా కొన్ని విషయాలతో మాతో ఒక 2-3 నిమిషాలు మాట్లాడితే మాకు సంతోషం. I would request you to speak for a few minutes. Thank you.
Deepak, put the spotlight on P.V. Manohar Rao Garu.
Sir, please unmute. Hello, please unmute.
Hello.
Yes, sir, now audible. Please continue.
Hello.
यस सर बोलिए
Is it
बोलिए
audible?
अभी सुनाई पड़ता है. नमस्कार बोलिए.
I am very much thankful for Shashi Tharoor, who is just now given so many details about foreign policy and other Indian economic policy, for which I am once again thanks him. I don't know whether he has recognized me or not, because after a long time we are seeing this is our centenary celebrations second meeting, I think. So many things we have to do about P.V. Narasimha Rao, whether it is state level or central level. We will discuss later, and I will thank you for your invitation, and further we will meet. Thank you.
नमस्ते.
Thank you, sir. You were so brief. We were expecting to hear much more, but I'm sure there's another day. Thank you for your presence. And now I invite our Secretary in charge, Shri Bose Raj Garu, to say a few words. The ICC Secretary in charge, Mr. Bose Raj Garu. I believe Mr. Bose Raju is not here right now. I saw him all throughout. Bose Raju Garu?
Okay, you can go to next.
Bose
He is not there currently, ma'am.
Then next.
I hope Mr. Srinivasan is here. Srinivasan Krishnan.
Yes, he's
kindly
there.
say
He's
a
there.
few words.
You can call him.
Dr. Shashi Tharoor ji, Member of Parliament from Thiruvananthapuram and former External Affairs Minister, General Secretary Kundia ji, PCC President Uttam Kumar Reddy ji, Geeta Reddy ji, all of the senior leaders of the party and all the participants. Actually, it's extremely difficult to speak after such a brilliant speaker like Dr. Shashi Tharoor, who is, I should say, is a master and pope in the external affairs industry and diplomacy. I have very little to add to what he has said. But one thing which I want to highlight about the style of functioning of P.V. Narasimha Rao ji, in contrast with the current day external affairs relationship, he says, at the end of the day, a very silent and professional manner in which if you are able to conduct the external affairs relationship, you don't have to organize drama and dance events in different countries to highlight the strength of our country. He conducted the external affairs, the relationship with other countries in such a dignified manner. I have heard in those days, I was in the civil service, I was OSD to Mr. K. Karunakaran, Industries Minister. I've heard at that time when foreign dignitaries come and when interpreters used to be there to translate, Narasimha Rao ji used to sometimes say, don't worry, I will speak to them in their language. He was a polyglot. And the foreign prime ministers and presidents of different countries used to respect him. And eventually the country used to get the kind of respect which it deserved. As Dr. Tharoor ji pointed out, that in 1991 when he took over, that was a time when the Soviet Union was in the decline and India was perceived to be in favor or in the Soviet bloc. And that was also a time when the Indian economy was opening up. He very shrewdly utilized that opportunity, that is opening up of a big market like the Indian economy, to attract US investors and corporates into this country and eventually made the United States also close to India. That was his political acumen, which we have to appreciate. Second thing is coming to into the regional area. As Dr. Kuntiaji has pointed out, we were able to sign the Mahakali hydroelectric agreement with Nepal. He went to China and whatever best he could do to enhance the relationship, he did. We signed the South Asian Preferential Trade Agreement with all the SAARC countries. He was a brilliant person. I think looking back 20 years later, we really appreciate the kind of efforts that he made to enhance the image of India internationally. I don't have anything more to add. The crux of the matter is he brought in economic diplomacy. Till then, India we are seen as a third world country. It was from 1991 onward, the world recognized that India is such a huge market so that India could utilize this economic diplomacy to enhance its influence internationally. Narasimha Rao ji gave the lead. The country has to be eternally thankful to him. Now, most of the points have been covered by brilliant speakers like Tharoor ji. I don't have anything more to add. Thank you so much for giving this opportunity to speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm so happy you could join us because I know you were busy.
I'm traveling actually. I'm in a car.
So very happy to have you over and listen to you. Now I invite one of our most senior leaders of the state, who has also been our PCC president, the dynamic Shri Hanumantrao Garu, former PCC president.
Our respected PCC President Uttam Kumar Reddy ji, my sister Geeta Reddy, celebration for PV Narasimha Rao, 1 year celebration, chairman, and also former minister and member of parliament Shashi Tharoor ji, and my friends. Today there is a lot of discussion has taken place about foreign policy. Because PV Narasimha not only foreign policy, he has done economy revolution he has taken. Economy liberalization he brought him. And third issue, because if anybody should not mistake, because his main idea, land ceiling. Because this is the main point, even Congress also doing is a celebration for, centenary celebration for Honorable former Prime Minister PV Narasimha Rao. Fortunate, I was the PCC president, he was also Prime Minister and AICC president. The board time I worked under him, but his idea, when he was started in politics, when he entered into politics in Telangana movement, Telangana before Andhra, on those days, those people was suffering like anything because there is no land. All upper class people has taken a land. At that time, people who are fighting for these common people, for getting this land. Ramananda Tirtha and also Jamlapuram Keshwara, under him he worked. Later he got the opportunity when he became the chief minister. At that time, he has given an idea for Sonia Gandhi, Indira Gandhi. Ma'am, unless you are not giving a land ceiling to common people, then only how those people can serve. After that, Indira Gandhi has introduced land ceiling. Today, because from here to 35 kilometers in Kisara, those 1981, these are people of Sonia Gandhi, Indira Gandhi and P.V. Narasimha Rao time, 1981, the land has given. Those people were cultivating, scheduled caste people. Today what happened? After so many years, the landlords again they have taken that land. At that time only 10 members was there. The farmers was the scheduled caste. Now today they became 150. So this issue also should be taken because foreign policy equal, economy liberalization is other side, but state government also. I requested to Keshara also. I wrote a letter to Prabhakar. Everybody was talking, but they are not taking that issue. Why P.V. Narasimha Rao is a less majority and he will continue as a Prime Minister. He has taken opposition into confidence. But today what is going on? Honorable Chief Minister, everything is saying that Bharat Ratna will support, everything will support. But what about land ceiling? There is a people are suffering. Whichever land they have given, again they are taking to landlords. This is a serious issue. Foreign policy, everything is there in other countries. But here is a people are suffering like anything. That issue also, my request, my sister Geeta Reddy should take this issue and also solve the problem because our Shashi Tharoor is expert about foreign policy. But P.V. Narasimha Rao, original idea, he is a landlord. He has given a 400 acres land for the poorer section of the society. Shashi Tharoor ji, ये भी आप याद रखो, P.V. Narasimha Rao गरीबों के वास्ते करा, landless people को करा. Foreign policy is the other side, but common people खाने को नहीं है, उनको भी help करा. तो इस वजह से in future में this issue also, land ceiling act also should be taken. Again we should say, Honorable Chief Minister K. Chandrasekhar Rao, why you are not taking land ceiling issue? People are suffering. They are taking, MROs are looting money like anything. They are not giving pattas. That also, these 1 year, P.V. Narasimha Rao centenary celebration, Congress should take this issue in village, we should go there, wherever injustice is there, then people will not forget P.V. Narasimha Rao or Indira Gandhi. These few words I want to thank one and all.
Well said, Anna. Hanmantrao Garu. Excellent, excellent. I think we must all appreciate that you brought out the land reforms. Of course, that's one of the most important subjects, and we missed Dr. Tharoor was given the subject, and we shall certainly, you're also honorary chairman along with me, we'll sort out and see that the next time we have a speaker who can speak about his land reforms. So having thanked you for being here and also giving a very good speech, I would like to call upon my colleague, the Vice Chairman of the Centenary Celebrations Committee, Mr. Sridhar Babu, who is the one who demanded a Bharat Ratna for P.V. Narasimha Rao Garu in a resolution in the Assembly when Mr. Kiran Kumar Reddy was our Chief Minister. So having said that, nobody can hijack P.V. Narasimha Rao Garu from the Congress. Congress and P.V. Narasimha Rao Garu are made for each other. So if anybody wants to hijack, I don't think they're going to end up with anything at all. So here you are. Please thank everybody for all the support that we have received.
Thank you, ma'am. Andariki namaskaram. Telangana Congress Committee Pakshana, Pradesh Congress Committee Adhyakshulu, Gaurav Uttam Kumar Reddy Garu, Ade Vidanga Telangana Congress Party Pakshana Centenary Celebrations lo Bhaganga Bharata Videshanga Vidhanala Vishayamlo P.V. Narasimha Rao Gari Patra విజయవంతమైన పాత్ర విజయంగా ఈరోజు కూడా వారు తీసుకున్న పలు నిర్ణయాల విషయంలో ఆలోచన చేసి మరి సెంటనరీ సెలబ్రేషన్స్ కమిటీ చైర్మన్ గారు మాజీ మంత్రివర్యులు గౌరవ గీతారెడ్డి గారితో పాటు గౌరవనీయులు పెద్దలు మాజీ పిసిసి అధ్యక్షులు మాజీ రాజ్యసభ సభ్యులు హనుమంతరావు గారు, మరి కమిటీ సభ్యులందరూ కూడా ఈరోజు భారత విదేశాంగానికి సంబంధించిన విధానాల విషయంలో పివి నరసింహారావు గారి పాత్ర విషయంలో ప్రముఖంగా ఒక ప్రముఖ దౌత్యవేత్త అయిన a very famous diplomat and former minister who served India at an international level, who is the best orator and who has done a human service to India, Sri Dr. Shashi Tharoor ji. You know, in this grandiose meeting held by the committee and the PCC, I joined along with Mr. Mahesh Gaud, the convener of the committee, Dr. Shravan Kumar, Dr. Mallu Ravi, former member of parliament, Dr. Shravan Kumar Reddy, Brother Venugopal, and most revered, and who is instrumental and motivated us for this deliberation, గౌరవనీయులు పెద్దలు పివి మనోహర్ రావు గారు అండ్ శ్రీ శ్యామ్ మోహన్ గారు, వినోద్ గారు, ఎక్స్ మినిస్టర్ వినోద్ గారితో పాటు పిసిసి సంబంధించిన కార్యవర్గ సభ్యులు, వర్కింగ్ ప్రెసిడెంట్, గౌరవ పార్లమెంట్ సభ్యులు, గౌరవ శాసన సభ్యులు, గౌరవ శాసన మండలి సభ్యులు, వీరందరూ కూడా ఈరోజు పార్టిసిపేట్ అయ్యి పివి నరసింహారావు గారు ప్రవేశపెట్టిన అనేక నిర్ణయాలకు సంబంధించి ముందు తరాలకు తెలియజేసే కార్యక్రమ భాగంలోనే టు నో and to let us know ourselves first. The policies undertaken by Sri P.V. Narasimha Rao garu and carry on to future generations. This is our prime motive, and this is what we would like to carry the centenary celebrations in the way we decided. And it's a honor and a privilege for me and to all the Telangana Pradesh Congress committee members and all the people of Telangana to hear a brilliant speech from Dr. Shashi Tharoor ji. Although the matter specifically is about the foreign policy, but Shashi Tharoor ji has interpreted well in terms of economic challenges the country faced, the diplomatic challenges the country faced, the socio-political structure then the country faced. We were really honored, and as told by our PCC president, it's very, very educative, sir, very informative, and future generations will learn from the great personality of India, to know about him, to be humble and to be famous. I would like to quote one. Once he said in US Congress, late P.V. Narasimha Rao garu, he quoted a famous historian. I quote, "History of the world is the biography of the great men," unquote. So this is where the great men live, like P.V. Narasimha Rao. And I would like to seek the intervention, because one side our PCC president, who is also the honorable member of parliament, who would be debating and deliberating so many issues back in the parliament. And when comparison comes, I would like to request Dr. Shashi Tharoor ji and also Uttam Kumar Reddy ji and all other colleagues at the parliament level P.V. Narasimha Rao ji, then in US Congress has referred our India as a multi-ethnic, multi-religious nation which is unassailable. He spoke about freedom of religion. He spoke about freedom of press. He spoke about freedom of press through habeas corpus. He spoke about fair and free trial. He spoke about rule of law in US Congress. Now the comparisons definitely will be drawn in regarding to the present day governance, and it is also a reminder to the people who are thriving on P.V. Narasimha Rao garu glory in guise. So, whatever you have been said, I would like to take 2 minutes of the time, ma'am. Whatever Dr. Shashi Tharoor ji was telling, through the context, he was reflecting few points. When India started negotiations on and suggestions to open up a diplomatic embassy in Israel, while I was watching Dr. Shashi Tharoor's speech, he was telling about how then Yasser Arafat was invited to India. In fact, we all know, and it is a learning lesson, how and from Yasser Arafat ji only came the proposal to open up a embassy in Israel, so that the opposition then had no criticism for it, opening up a embassy in Israel. Otherwise, opposition would have made a hue and cry about it. In the same way as Dr. Shashi Tharoor ji has put it, when Shivashankar Menon was negotiating a part and parcel of the Indo-China relations, we heard that and we read about P.V. Narasimha Rao ji telling Shivashankar Menon to go in and ask all the opposition leaders for their suggestions. The towering leaders like Vajpayee ji, Gujral ji, Advani ji, George Fernandes, he has been approached by our secretaries who were dealing with the negotiations, and they took all the suggestions. Ultimately, what has been said by Dr. Shashi Tharoor regarding peace and tranquility border-related agreement was agreed in a unanimous voice. This is how our P.V. Narasimha Rao used to take the foreign policy, and which made every Indian successful on the diplomatic arena. So on India-Israel too, coming up from a mouth of the Yasser Arafat ji to open up an embassy is a master stroke in terms of the foreign related policies of P.V. Narasimha Rao ji. When Dr. Shashi Tharoor is really educated about Indo-China, Indo-Israel, Indo-US, Indo-USSR, ASEAN, and look East policy, and our policy towards East is really very educative, sir. And we shall strive. And our committee will take your speech and translate in Telugu, so that the future generations will take this and will know about, what contribution really P.V. Narasimha Rao garu has done to our nation, has done to our state, has done to our own people, that is our Telugu people. I thank all other dignitaries who are on WhatsApp, Facebook, Twitter groups, who are watching us, and we would appreciate the novel suggestions from you in our year-long celebrations which we are going to do. The mention of Sri V. Hanumanta Rao garu about land reforms is already been discussed by PCC President garu and our chairman. Hopefully we will take it in a due course. And once again, I thank all the people who have joined this virtual meeting. And we thank Telangana Pradesh Congress Committee office bearers, the social media group headed by Deepak John and others who made this possible. I once again thank our chief guest, Dr. Shashi Tharoor ji, Dr. R.C. Kuntia ji, Bose Raj garu, and Srinivasan garu for taking all your time out and educating us. Thank you. Thank you one and all. Yeah. I forgot to mention one. A volunteer, a leader, Mr. K.K. Raja, who has made it possible. I announce now this meeting is closed.
Bye, Geeta, Uttam. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.